In a quiet suburban town somewhere in the United States, where mornings smelled like fresh coffee and freshly cut grass, there lived a young man named Daniel Harper, an ordinary guy with an extraordinary desire to become someone important one day. He wasn't lazy by nature, nor was he particularly gifted, but he carried inside him a restless feeling that his life was meant for more, something bigger, something worth remembering. Every night as he lay in bed scrolling endlessly through his phone, he consumed hours of motivational videos, powerful speeches, and success stories that filled him with excitement and a sense of urgency. In those moments, Daniel truly believed that he was just one decision away from transforming his entire life. He would sit up, energized, his heart racing, promising himself that starting tomorrow, everything would change, that he would wake up early, work harder than ever before, study longer, train stronger, and finally become the person he always imagined. But tomorrow had a strange habit of never quite arriving the way he expected. The alarm would ring early in the morning, and instead of jumping out of bed with determination, Daniel would hit snooze just once, then again, and then again until the morning was gone. The plans he made the night before slowly faded into vague intentions, replaced by comfort, distractions, and the quiet whisper of, "Just one more day won't hurt." Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and although Daniel kept watching, listening, and dreaming, nothing in his real life seemed to change. The gap between who he was and who he wanted to be grew wider, and with it came frustration, self-doubt, and a growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong. Daniel often wondered why the motivation that felt so powerful at night disappeared so quickly by morning. It confused him, annoyed him, and slowly drained his confidence. He began to suspect that maybe he lacked something essential, something other people seemed to have naturally. He noticed people around him who were steadily improving, achieving goals, building habits, and moving forward, while he remained stuck in the same place, despite all his intentions. It wasn't that he didn't care, and it certainly wasn't that he didn't try, but his efforts were inconsistent, unpredictable, and entirely dependent on how he felt in the moment. One early morning, long before sunrise, when the streets were still quiet and the sky carried a faint hint of blue, Daniel found himself unable to sleep. Something inside him felt unsettled, almost urgent, as if his life had been paused for too long and was quietly demanding movement. Without fully understanding why, he got dressed and stepped outside, letting the cool air wake him up in a way no alarm ever could. His feet carried him toward a nearby public park, a place he rarely visited but somehow felt drawn to at that moment. The park was nearly empty, except for a few distant figures moving slowly along the walking path. Among them was an older man, probably in his late 60s, jogging at a steady, unhurried pace. There was nothing particularly impressive about his speed, his posture, or his appearance, yet something about his consistency stood out immediately. Lap after lap, step after step, the man continued without hesitation, without distraction, without pause. Daniel found himself watching him longer than expected, intrigued by the quiet determination in each movement. There was no excitement, no dramatic intensity, no visible burst of motivation, just a calm, repetitive action that seemed almost mechanical and yet deeply intentional. It was as if the man wasn't negotiating with himself, wasn't debating whether to continue or stop, but had already made that decision long ago. The simplicity of it was strangely powerful. Daniel returned to the park the next day and the day after that, each time noticing the same man running at the same hour, following the same path, maintaining the same steady rhythm regardless of the weather or conditions. Rain came one morning, light but persistent, and still the man was there. The wind picked up another day, cold and sharp, and still he ran. There were no breaks, no visible excuses, no hesitation. Over time, Daniel began to understand something that had never fully made sense before. This man wasn't driven by bursts of inspiration or emotional highs, and he certainly wasn't relying on motivation to carry him forward. What he had was something quieter, something less exciting but far more reliable. It was discipline, built not in a moment of passion, but over countless ordinary days of showing up and doing the work, regardless of how he felt. This realization struck Daniel harder than any motivational speech he had ever heard. He started to see his own pattern clearly, almost painfully. His entire approach to change had been based on waiting for the right feeling, the right moment, the perfect surge of energy that would finally push him forward. But those moments were temporary, unpredictable, and impossible to sustain. He had been trying to build a consistent life on an inconsistent foundation. The more he thought about it, the more obvious it became. Motivation had always been the spark, but never the fuel. It could ignite excitement, but it couldn't keep the fire burning. That required something else entirely, something less glamorous but far more powerful. Inspired by this quiet observation, Daniel decided to experiment with a different approach. Instead of planning massive changes or waiting for a surge of inspiration, he committed to doing just a few small actions every single day, no matter what. He chose a fixed time in the morning to wake up, not based on how he felt, but based on a decision he made in advance. He set a short study period, a simple workout routine, and a limited amount of focused work. All manageable, all realistic, but most importantly, all consistent. The first few days were uncomfortable, even frustrating. His body resisted, his mind complained, and every excuse he had ever used suddenly returned with renewed strength. The urge to skip just one day felt overwhelming at times, especially when there was no immediate reward, no visible progress, no sense of excitement to carry him through. But for the first time, Daniel didn't argue with those thoughts. He didn't try to silence them or replace them with positive affirmations. He simply acknowledged them and continued anyway. Something subtle began to shift within him. By removing the need to feel motivated, he eliminated the constant internal conflict that had held him back for so long. There was no more debate, no more bargaining, no more maybe later or starting tomorrow. There was only the action itself, repeated daily, quietly and steadily. Weeks passed, and although the changes were small at first, they were undeniable. Daniel felt more stable, more focused, and strangely more at peace. His days no longer depended on unpredictable emotional swings, but followed a structure that gradually became natural. The actions that once felt forced slowly turned into habits, and the habits began to shape his identity. Months later, the transformation was no longer subtle. His energy improved, his confidence grew, and his results began to reflect the effort he had been putting in consistently. He wasn't perfect, and he still had difficult days, but those days no longer stopped him. They simply became part of the process, not an excuse to abandon it. Looking back, Daniel realized that the most important change hadn't been external at all. It wasn't the improved performance, the better routine, or even the visible progress. It was the shift in how he approached his life. He no longer waited for the right mood or the perfect moment. He acted because he had decided to act, and that decision remained unchanged regardless of how he felt. Years later, people in his town began to notice his consistency, his discipline, and the steady way he handled challenges. Some assumed he had always been like that, naturally driven and focused. Others believed he had discovered some secret that set him apart. But the truth was far simpler and far more accessible. Daniel Harper had once been the same as everyone else, full of intentions but lacking consistency, driven by emotion but held back by it as well. The difference was not talent, luck, or even intelligence. The difference was that he had stopped relying on motivation and started building discipline, one small action at a time, repeated daily without negotiation. And in that quiet, almost invisible shift, his entire life changed. Not in a single dramatic moment, not through a burst of inspiration, but through a steady, unwavering commitment to doing what needed to be done, even when it was boring, even when it was difficult, and especially when he didn't feel like it. Because in the end, success was never about how intensely someone started, but about how consistently they continued, and Daniel had finally learned how to continue. Tell us in the comments, are you disciplined and do you respond to mood swings? I'd love to hear.